I think it's important if we take some time to discuss a handful of key building blocks to the Laravel framework. If you can truly understand these, you're going to have a big head start. So let's get started. The first is Laravel's service container. It's one of the core pieces of the framework. Let me show you how it works. You've already seen it in action over here. So notice in our projects controller, the show method accepts a project, and miraculously, we receive it. Now, I told you that this is available through a concept known as route model binding, but that's only half of it. There's also the service container component. And to demonstrate that, consider this. One of the objects or classes that Laravel offers is a file system class. So I'm going to import that, illuminate file system. We'll call it file. And all I'm going to do here is dump that file object. So once again, if you're working along, we've imported this class. All we did was type hint it in our show method. And then when we dump it, let's see what we get. Okay, I will click on any of these projects. And sure enough, we get an instance of that file system class. Now, the file system class, just as an aside, that can be used to interact with files in any number of ways. You can fetch the contents of a file. You can put to a file. You can read a file. You can delete it. Lots of things there. Anyways, the key thing I want you to be aware of is this is kind of amazing. All you did was type into class, and Laravel gave it to you. Don't underestimate how cool this is. Laravel was kind of a trailblazer in this regard. Now, behind the scenes, to make this work, Laravel uses, again, two components here. One is a concept known as auto-resolving. It's actually kind of a bit of black magic where Laravel is able to use the reflection API. It reads this, it figures out, okay, you type in file system here. It sounds like you probably want an instance of that. Now, the step 2 of this is it will check into what is known as a service container. Think of that as a big block of key value pairs at a very basic form. Think of it as a big box of key value pairs. Now, Laravel is going to look into that box like a little kid looking into their toy chest. And it's going to check, well, do I have a file system in here? It's moving around. It's looking. Is there a file system? Oh, there it is. Okay, that's probably what the user wants. So I'm going to resolve that or fetch it or get it out of the toy box or the container. And we're going to give it to the user. We're going to pass it to them so that they're not responsible for wiring up all of this stuff. I'm just going to do it for them because that's probably what they want anyways. Again, this is very, very cool stuff. I want to show you another example. So let me backtrack. And I'm going to go to my route/web file. Often when I just want to toy around with a concept, this is a good place to put it. It'll execute on every page load. So it gives you a place to just kind of tinker, to brainstorm. And then when you're done, you delete it. Now, Laravel's application itself is a service container, and we can get things out of it using this helpful function app. Or if you want, there's another one called resolve. It's just an alias. They do the exact same thing. Some people like the phrasing of resolve this out of the container, but it doesn't matter, whatever you want. Now, earlier we had the file system class, right? So if we were to replicate that, I'm going to import that one more time. If we were to use this app function and give it the full class path, we would get the same thing. So within the home page callback, let's see if that's true. I switch back to Chrome, we visit the home page, and yes, I do get the same thing. Okay. Now, as it turns out, there's actually many layers to this. So stick around and let's see if we can make sense of this. I'm going to put something into the container. So I said we had that app helper function. Well, if we call it and we don't pass any arguments to it, we can grab that instance and then call any number of methods on it. So I'm going to bind something into the container. I'm not fetching anything. I am depositing a toy into the toy box, to use that simile. So let's say bind foobar or example into the container. Now, when I fetch example out of the container, what do we want to receive? What is the value associated with this key? Okay, well, in preparation for this episode, I created a little dummy plain old PHP class called example. So why don't we return that? It should return a new instance of app example. Okay, we have bound something into Laravel's service container. So we wrapped up some toy, we gave it a name of example, and we threw it into the toy box. Okay, now when I fetch it out of the toy box, What exactly do I want to fetch? I want to fetch a new instance of example. Okay, so I want to see if this works. I'm now, when we load the home page, going to fetch example out of the toy box or the service container. I'm done with that example. We're going to stick with service container terminology from now on. You get the idea. Anyways, if I come back and give this a refresh, sure enough, I have an instance of example. Cool. So we now know how to put things into the service container. But let me show you one other thing. Let's grab 2 instances out of the container. So we're going to dump one fetch and then another fetch. Okay, if I come back and give it a refresh, we do have 2, but I want you to notice this little unique identifier there, 203 and 198. Think of it as like a shorthand, an identifier for this instance of example. And what I want you to notice is they're different. They are 2 separate instances of the example class. And I'd say maybe most of the time that's what you want, but not always. Sometimes all you ever care about is a single instance. We can refer to this as a singleton. I only ever need one instance of this class, hence the word singleton. Now, if you want to do that with Laravel, rather than binding into the container, you can register a singleton with the container. Okay, so now, if we resolve it out, I want you to notice 203, 198. Those should be the same when I give it a refresh, and they are. So now we know if I register a singleton into the container, anytime I resolve anything out of it, it will get the exact same instance. They are identical, which means this code will only ever run a maximum of 1 time. After that, we will fetch the existing object whenever you request it, and we'll return it to you. All right, so we know 3 concepts now. We can bind things into the service container. We throw it into a box, we give it a name, and when we need the value associated with it, we can receive it. Okay, so now we have some core concepts here. We can bind things into the container. We can bind a singleton into the container. And of course, we can fetch out of the container. Now, what would happen if we tried to resolve something out of the container that didn't exist? All right, let's come back and give it a refresh. We get a reflection exception. Remember when I noted that Laravel uses some pretty cool reflection API usage to figure out what it is you want. So it's actually, the underlying code's fairly complex, and I don't want to overwhelm you. So just for kind of a quick idea of what's going on, Laravel is going to do a number of checks. So when we request example out of the container, it's going to check, well, do I have anything in the service container called example? No, I don't have anything here. But then it's going to do some other checks outside of the container. It's going to check, well, is this a class name? Maybe if you're just giving me a class name, you want a new instance of that. And I can do that for you. You don't have to put it in the container at all. I'll just do it for you automatically. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But that doesn't work here either. It's not a class. It's just a string. So at the end, it kind of puts its arms up and it lets you know, hey, I don't know what you want to do. I'm just going to throw an exception here. I do not know how to resolve this for you. But this is important to know. In the absence of a key in the container equal to what we're referencing here, it will try to check if there's a class. Which means, what if I used the full class path to example? Okay, let's switch back, give it a refresh, and we still get it. All right, so once again, I didn't bind anything into the container called example. There is no key in the toy box called example. But still, Laravel knew what I wanted. And that's because it went through that order of operations. One more time, I just want to say it one more time to make sure we're all on the same page. It looks in the container and it checks, well, is there anything called app example? If so, of course, that's what you want. But in the absence of it, well, is there a class called app example? Yes, there is. Okay, well, let me just do my best to instantiate example, and I'll give it back to you without you having to do a thing. That's what I mean when I say auto-resolving. And we get it. Okay, so what if here we bound it into the container, we called it app example, we switch back, we give it a refresh, and now it's using this code here. And in fact, I'll show you. Give it a refresh, and yes, this is taking precedence because it looks in the service container for this key first. And only if it doesn't find it, does it fall back to checking, well, is there a class path I can use instead, as you see there? Okay, this is really good to know. But you might be thinking now, what if example has its own constructor. Something like maybe it needs a foo class. And we'll accept that, and I will construct that. Okay. Namespace will be app. And yeah, once again, it looks like example is being composed with foo. All right. Well, let's switch back, give it a refresh. And what do you know? That works as well. This is total black magic when you think about it. It is so very, very cool that this works in Laravel. Easily one of the most brilliant components to the framework, I would say. So what can we learn from this? All right. Well, there was nothing in the service container called example. Laravel figured out, all right, well, I didn't see anything in the container. I do see an example class. It's probably what you want. So I'm going to instantiate that for you. But as part of it, it came to the constructor and it saw, all right, well, example is being constructed with foo, at which point it goes through that entire cycle again. All right, well, let me see if I can inject foo for you. I do see a foo class here. That's probably what you want. So I will instantiate that and then I will pass it in for you. All of this is being done for free. You didn't have to wire up any of this stuff the way you might have to in past frameworks. And we're not going to take it any further, but if you wanted, if foo had its own constructor, Laravel would keep going through that loop to give you exactly what you need. So now, I hope this better illustrates that when I type hint things like file system here, what's happening behind the scenes is Laravel's auto-resolving the object for you using the service container. Or even when I'm not type hinting, I can use this app helper function, or like I said, there's an alias called resolve if you like that more. I usually stick with app, but resolve is cool too. Anyways, alternatively, I can do it here. Illuminate, file system, file system. You now know that if you ever need to grab something out of the container, you can do so. I now have an instance of the file system class. And then finally, you learned that in the situations where you need to register something into the container yourself, for example, maybe I want to register a singleton for a Twitter client or something like that. Maybe I'll call it Twitter. And then within here, I would instantiate Twitter. I need to give it some kind of configuration value for the Twitter API key that we don't have registered. So I'll just do a random string. But yeah, maybe whenever you request Twitter out of the service container, well, we just want a singleton, and we want it to be equal to a new instance of some Twitter class that accepts the API key through the constructor. Well, now you can do that. We switch back. All you'd have to say is, hey, I want Twitter out of the container. And actually, let's get this to work, and then I think we'll call it a day. So let's just die and dump that. Next, we need some kind of Twitter class. So why don't we call it app services Twitter? I'll create that. App, new services folder called Twitter. Namespace is app services, and the class is Twitter. And then finally, the constructor needs some kind of API key. All right, there we go. So we have registered this in the service container. In our projects controller, we have requested it out of the container, and then we dump it on the page. So we switch back, we click on any project, and sure enough, we do have our instance of our Twitter class with the API key locked and loaded and ready to go. And finally, well, what about if you want to accept it through the parameter list? Well, we could say we want Twitter there, switch back, refresh, but we can't do that there because Laravel doesn't know what this means. And actually, there are ways to deal with the variable name as well, but I'm not going to get into that. Why don't we do this instead? Let's switch to using a class path. App services Twitter. And if we switch back, now I will type hint it. Laravel will once again read the type hint. It'll say, okay, you want an instance of app services Twitter. It looks in its container. I have a singleton registered for that. So it sounds like this is what you want every time you request that. All right, let's switch back, refresh, and now it's working again. So you have so much flexibility here. And often when I've recorded this series in the past, this episode is the one that really spooks people. They understand everything up until this point, and then suddenly it seems very confusing and too high level for them. That's okay. If you need to watch this episode one more time And even if you don't reach for this for a little bit, just know it's available to you. Laravel has this thing called a container. You can put things into it, and then of course you can fetch out of the container when you need it. So the key terms for this episode are service container and auto resolution. Fancy, confusing, scary terms that hopefully you now understand.